Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman. He's the author of Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian. We're going to be giving away this copy right here. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest, and you could win this copy. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Joseph Fielding Smith's fight against evolution. We'll also talk about his fight against RLDS polygamy skeptics, as well as hiding the first vision account from 1832. You won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because Talmage and Widtsoe, like you said, were kind of pro-science and the evolution's not terrible. And they ran into a brick wall with Joseph Fielding Smith, who was like, evolution's awful and evil and we shouldn't believe in it. Can you talk about those tussles between Talmage and Widtsoe and Smith?
Yeah, absolutely. The most famous of these, right, is over Roberts's book, The Truth, the Way, the Life, which Roberts writes in the 1920s and which he submits for publication by the church in 1930. And in this book, Roberts is doing a lot of the same kind of stuff that a lot of liberal Protestants of that time are doing, which is to say to try to find ways to reconcile two things, the theory of evolution, but also contemporary geological work on the age of the earth with the book of Genesis and with creation narratives. And Roberts proposes in this book that the earth is indeed as old as the scientists say it is. It is billions and billions of years old. He also proposes that there were human-like creatures, which are famously called pre-Adamites, living on the earth. And what makes Adam and Eve distinctive is not that they were the first humans, but they were the first humans with souls. They were the first humans of our sort, Homo sapiens. It was with Adam and Eve that God began his work. Even though the theory of evolution, or the processes of evolution, I should say, might have generated human-like creatures before Adam and Eve. This is how Roberts, right, is trying to reconcile the notion of a real Adam and Eve with the fossil record of ancient hominids. Fielding Smith really, he sees this manuscript because he is an apostle at this point. He becomes an apostle in 1910, and he is serving on the church's publications committee, which reviews all of these things for publication. And he just absolutely rejects this. He rejects first the notion that the earth is billions and billions of years old, but he also rejects the notion that there were pre-Adamites because Fielding Smith believes wholeheartedly in this proposition that there was no death before the fall, that the fall introduces death into the creation. And that is the principle that he wants to defend. It's not simply that he opposes evolution. Oftentimes people kind of casually say, well, he didn't like this book because it supported the theory of evolution, but really it didn't, right? Roberts is trying to sort of thread a needle here. He's not full-throatedly embracing the theory of evolution, but he is proposing the idea of no death before the fall. And Fielding Smith thought that if there was death before the fall of Adam and Eve, then that sort of undoes the atonement, the need for an atonement, the necessity for atonement. So Fielding Smith tries to stop this book from getting published. He protests to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and its president, Rutger Clausen. He protests to the First Presidency. And while this tussle is happening behind the scenes, out in public, Fielding Smith gives a speech at the Utah Genealogical Society, which is a church-sponsored organization that today is called the Family History Library, right? It was a church organization that promoted doing genealogy. And Fielding Smith denounces this idea of a very old earth and of pre-Adamites. And he says, even among general authorities, there were some people who somehow can believe this. In response to that, James Talmage gives a talk called The Earth and Man, in which Talmage endorses the idea that the Earth might actually be far older than just 6,000 years. So there is some kind of public sniping happening here as well. And eventually, both Roberts and Fielding Smith give presentations to the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, in which they're both kind of defending their ideas on this. And importantly, I think Fielding Smith, when he defends this idea and his theories about this, he says, it's not just me who is saying this, right? Fielding Smith says, I am giving you a plain interpretation of the scriptures. It is the same interpretation of the scriptures that my uncle or my great uncle, my father, and my grandfather, Joseph and Hiram Smith, all believed in. So you can read him as doing two things there. On the one hand, right, he is kind of invoking his family and saying, like, my family is the leading family of this church. But he also, I think, there is saying that my reading of the scriptures is the reading of the prophets. It is the reading of the apostles. No other of the general authorities of the church have endorsed B.H. Roberts' ideas about pre-Adamites and so on and so forth. That's not exactly true, though. Orson Hyde, who was an apostle in the days of Brigham Young, did, but that's the only general authority that Roberts could point to, right? And so Fielding Smith here is saying that my reading of the scriptures is that backed by the old leaders of the church. It is Roberts who is stepping out of line here, not me.
My reading is the correct reading.
Yeah, for those reasons, right? Reasons of ecclesiastical authority, reasons of lineage, and reasons of scripture, right? Now, Roberts is arguing that Fielding Smith's readings of the scripture are not self-evident. But Roberts can only really point to Orson Hyde and the fact that he is trying to reconcile these stories with science as well. Now,
when you said Orson Hyde, did you mean Orson Pratt?
No, I mean Orson Hyde.
It was Hyde. Because I thought Pratt was kind of along those lines as well.
Not pre-Adamites. Pre-Adamites is Hyde. So eventually the first presidency more or less just shuts this down, and they don't endorse either side. The first presidency says, essentially, we just want you all to stop fighting about this. And so we're not going to allow Roberts' book to be published. But at the same time, we want Fielding Smith to stop sniping at Roberts in public addresses. And there things are left. Now, as you said earlier, though, one reason why ultimately we might look at Smith as the winner of this is that Smith outlives everybody else involved here. And he is still alive and kicking 20-odd years later. And at that point, he publishes his book, Man, His Origin, and Destiny, which is based on a lot of the work he did to refute Roberts in the first place. And that book has multiple chapters just blasting Darwinism, attacking Charles Darwin, but also multiple chapters denouncing what is sometimes called the higher criticism of the Bible, which is to say, this sort of reading of the Bible through the lenses of modern archaeology and modern geology, which Roberts was trying to assimilate as well.
And the documentary hypothesis and things like that. He didn't like any of that stuff.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'm trying to remember. So his father, Joseph F., was 6 years old when Hiram and Joseph died. And then he became the prophet, I don't remember, I think it was 1918. Does that sound right? Or no, he died in 1918.
Joseph F.?
Joseph F., yes.
Joseph F. becomes president of the church in 1901, and he dies in 1918.
Right. And then, so I wonder how much, because he was called, Joseph F. was called to Congress to testify, which had to be very, what's the word? I don't know if traumatic is the right word, but very influential on Joseph Fielding as well. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this is actually partly why Fielding Smith indeed begins getting involved in polemics and in what we might call apologetics, right, which is the tradition of attempting to defend right belief. So yes, F. Smith is called to testify before Congress in the Reed Smoot hearings, Reed Smoot being the LDS apostle who was sent to the Senate, and there was a big set of hearings and debates in the Senate about whether or not Reed Smoot should be allowed to take his seat because he was an LDS apostle. Fielding Smith Joseph F. Smith goes to Congress to testify, and he is subjected to some very sort of withering questioning about the practice of polygamy, whether or not it was still happening in secret, even though Woodruff's manifesto had essentially ended it in 1890, about what it meant to be a prophet, and so on and so forth. During all
blood
of these,
atonement as well, and the oaths in the temple. Yeah.
all sorts of stuff, right? During these hearings, another group of people see an opportunity, and that group is the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So Richard Evans, who's an apostle of the RLDS Church, is lambasting all of these broadsides. He's accusing Brigham Young of coming up with polygamy. He is denouncing the notion of blood atonement, which, as you know, is being talked about in Congress. He's pinning that on Brigham Young as well. And essentially, Evans is making the case, right, that the LDS Church is corrupted. It is not the genuine church that Joseph Smith founded. That is, in fact, the RLDS Church, which is led by descendants of Joseph Smith himself. Joseph Smith III, of course, but then his son, Frederick Madison Smith, and so on and so on and so on, right? So, Joseph F. Smith is infuriated with what his cousins in the RLDS Church are doing.
It's a family feud. It really is.
In a very real sense, it is a family feud. And so he goes to his son, Joseph Fielding Smith, and says, I want you to refute this guy, Richard Evans.
Oh.
And Fielding Smith does begin doing that. Some of his first publications are small pamphlets taking on Richard Evans and denouncing Richard Evans' ideas. So there's a large pamphlet about the origins of polygamy, in which he makes the case that polygamy is not actually founded by Brigham Young. Polygamy was Joseph Smith Jr.'s idea. And he and Evans have a real kind of tussle in newspaper op-ed pages about these sorts of ideas. And that really launches Fielding Smith into his career as a researcher and a writer. He begins working in the church historian's office while he is having this pamphlet feud with Richard Evans, and he becomes church historian pretty soon after and serves as church historian for decades.
50 years, wasn't it?
Until he becomes president of the church.
So he had a little bit of influence on affecting church history and making it quite apologetic and less scholarly, I guess we could say.
Well, insofar as scholarly history is a thing in the early 20th century, right? This is also a period in which what we would today call academic history is sort of being invented by professionals. But it is true, right? Fielding Smith always, throughout all of his life, he is part of this trend in American Christianity in the late 19th and early 20th century, a period in which professionalization becomes a real concept. This is the period in which lawyers are beginning to have to pass bar exams and go to law school. It is a period in which governments at the state and local and national level are beginning to think maybe it's a good idea that we have certification exams for doctors and dentists and don't just let anybody call themselves a doctor and a dentist and start practicing it in the corner store. It is also a period in which American academics are beginning to adopt this German model of postgraduate education and granting PhDs. And so the first people with PhDs in history begin coming out of Johns Hopkins University in the late 19th century. And they are beginning then in the early 20th century to say there is a right way to do history. And here is how you have to use sources. And here is how you have to cite your evidence and stuff like that. So that's happening at this very same time. And Joseph Fielding Smith is looking at all of this. And he's watching other apostles in his church, like Widtsoe and Talmage and Joseph Merrill and eventually Adam Bennion. All of these apostles and people like B.H. Roberts too are looking at this world of professionalization and saying, we want to talk to you people. We want to show how our religion meets all of your standards and is respectable. But Fielding Smith never does. Fielding Smith looks at those people and he says, you're the enemy. Right, you are out to destroy faith. He's looking at professional historians who are, for the most part, saying, like, religion, visions of God, and stuff like that, that's not footnotable. I can't cite God. I cannot put the first vision in my footnote. And so you're seeing professional academics writing books in which they're saying Joseph Smith Jr. was an epileptic. and that's why he thought he saw God, which is the argument in one of the earliest non-LDS biographies of Joseph Smith by a guy named with the wonderful name of Woodbridge Riley. Woodbridge Riley argues that Joseph Smith was an epileptic. And Fielding Smith is reading books like this, and he's thinking, these people are just out to destroy religion, right? And so we don't want to build bridges with them. We don't want to reach out to these professional academics. They are hostile to us. And of course, because of his upbringing and his family, he is primed to see the outside world as hostile to begin with.
Very interesting. You know, I think there's one of the big scandals, or whatever the word is, about Joseph Fielding Smith especially, is he's the one who supposedly hid I believe it was the 1832 account of the first vision. Can you talk about that?
Yes, so the 1832 account of the first vision is in a diary that Joseph Smith kept, which Joseph Fielding Smith had custody over because of his status as church historian. And at some point, 3 pages of that diary containing the early account of the first vision, which is somewhat different from the later canonized account in 1838, were removed. Now, it is unclear who exactly did this. Fielding Smith is a plausible candidate because it was in his custody, but there were some other people who worked in church archives as well. Earl Olson, who was quite a traditionalist himself, had access to these things as well. We do know, actually, that Fielding Smith later showed Levi Young, who was a member of the First Quorum of the 70, or president of the 70, Fielding Smith showed him that 1832 account. So he did have possession of it. All of these things were in his office safe. And eventually then, when the leaves are eventually restored, they're put back by archivists in the 1990s. He's a really plausible candidate for cutting it out, but we're not really sure who, we're not sure why. It is something of a mystery.
Okay, so he got the blame whether he actually did it or not. Is that right?
Yeah, and certainly, he was the person responsible for this book, right? He was the church historian. So, if somebody else cut it out, that's not good archival practice either for him to allow that to happen. All of this treatment of this really, really priceless document in this way is quite scandalous for whatever reason it was done and whoever did it.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman, author of Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian. We're going to be giving away this copy right here. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest and you could win this copy. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about apologetic versus academic history. Is there really an objective history out there?
There is no history and no source that does not have bias. When a student walks in, and especially a Mormon studies student, they might come in and say, I want to do objective history of Mormonism. I will say, that is not a thing. There is no objective history of anything in this world. The question is, what biases does your source have? And writing academic history that lives up to academic standards, is itself actually a bias. It is
really?
Yeah, it's absolutely a bias, right? But it is the sort of bias, right, that exists to allow scholars to communicate with each other in an intelligible way.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.